There is a sound that every experienced outdoorsman knows. The sound of something heavy moving through dry leaves at night. You've heard it. Maybe around a campsite. Maybe on a trail after dark. That rhythmic crunch and crush of something with weight, real weight, pressing down on the forest floor with every step. You know that sound. Now I want you to imagine lying flat on your back inside a thin nylon tent, sleeping bag pulled to your chin, headlamp off, and hearing that sound, not once, not approaching and then fading away like a deer passing through, but circling, slow, deliberate, patient, around your tent, around you, starting at roughly 11 o'clock on the left side of the tent, moving to 9 o'clock, then 7, then directly behind your head at 6, then 4, then 3, then 2, then back to 12, directly in front of the tent door. One complete circle. Then it started again. I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not someone who panics in the wilderness. My name is Daniel Rourke. I'm 38 years old. I've been a backcountry wilderness guide in the Appalachian region for 11 years. I've logged over 400 nights in remote wilderness. I've had black bear encounters, mountain lion encounters, encounters with unstable people in remote areas. I have never, not once in 11 years, been truly afraid in the woods. Until the night of September 6th. Deep in the Monongahela National Forest, West Virginia. Mile 34 of a solo route I had walked 17 times before, where something that moved on 2 legs and breathed like a furnace circled my tent for 2 hours and 40 minutes in the dark, and then stopped, right at the door. I have the audio. I have photographs of what was left on the ground the next morning. And I have something I've never shown anyone, footage from my chest-mounted GoPro that I activated inside the tent that night, with hands so unsteady I could barely find the button. By the time this video is over, you will never set up a tent in the Appalachians the same way again. Mile 34, the place I thought I knew. Let me tell you about Monongahela. Most people outside of the Mid-Atlantic outdoor community haven't spent real time there. They know Shenandoah. They know the Great Smokies. They'll do sections of the At and call it an Appalachian experience. Monongahela is different. 1.1 million acres of West Virginia wilderness. One of the largest national forests east of the Mississippi. Elevation ranging from 1,000 feet in the valley floors to over 4,800 feet on the high ridges. Dense hardwood forest, red oak, black cherry, yellow birch, hemlock, so thick in places that midday sunlight barely reaches the ground. Dozens of wilderness areas within the forest where no motorized equipment is permitted and trail maintenance is minimal at best. Terrain that swallows people. I mean that literally. The Monongahela has an uncomfortable history of search and rescue operations. People who wander off marked trails and don't come back for days. People who come back changed, disoriented, unable to explain where they'd been or what they'd experienced. I'd been on 2 SAR operations in that forest myself over the years. Found both subjects alive. One of them, a 47-year-old experienced hiker, refused to tell the rangers what had happened to him on his second night out, just kept shaking his head and saying, "I don't want to talk about it in these woods. Not here." At the time, I thought he was suffering from exposure-related confusion. I don't think that anymore. The route I was running in September was one I'd developed myself over several years of exploring the forest's southern wilderness sections. 47 miles total. 5 nights out, it threaded through 3 distinct wilderness areas, crossed 11 stream drainages, and climbed over 2 major ridge systems before dropping back to the trailhead. Mile 34, where I'd set my camp that September night, sat in a broad hollow between Gauley Mountain and a secondary ridge I'd never bothered to name. Good campsite. Flat ground. A small stream 20 yards to the east for water. Heavy hemlock canopy overhead providing natural wind protection. I'd camped in that exact hollow 4 times before. I set up at around 6:30 p.m. Late September light was already going amber and low by then, the shadows in the hollow going deep and blue by 7. I cooked a simple meal, freeze-dried pasta, black coffee, and sat outside the tent for a while watching the last light die out of the sky above the ridge. It was quiet. Genuinely, deeply quiet in the way only remote wilderness gets. No road noise, no aircraft, no human sound of any kind, just the creek, the wind in the high canopy, the first tentative calling of a barred owl somewhere up the ridge. I remember thinking, this is why I do this. I was in the tent by 8:30, asleep by 9. I did not know that approximately 2 miles up the ridge above my campsite, on a game trail that cut through a dense stand of second-growth laurel, something was already moving downhill, moving toward the hollow, moving toward the flat ground, moving toward me. Something was wrong before dark. I need to back up by about 4 hours. Because looking back now, with everything I know, there were signs I missed. Signs I explained away with the confident logic of someone who thinks they understand a landscape completely. The first sign came at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, about 3 miles before I reached my campsite. I was crossing a ridge saddle, a low point between 2 higher elevation sections, when I came across a tree I had to stop and look at. A yellow birch. Mature tree, maybe 14 inches in diameter, at roughly 8 feet off the ground. The bark had been scraped clean in a vertical strip, about 18 inches long and 6 inches wide. Not rubbed, scraped, like something had dragged a hard surface downward across the bark with significant force, removing the outer layer completely. The raw wood beneath was pale and fresh. This had happened recently, within the last day or 2 at most. Deer rubs. I know deer rubs. Bucks will work a tree with their antlers during rut, but rut in West Virginia doesn't typically kick in until October, sometimes late September at the very earliest. And this wasn't antler work. The scrape was too wide, too smooth, without the lateral scoring that antler tines leave. The height was also wrong for a deer. 8 feet is beyond the reach of any whitetail in the Appalachians. Bear, I told myself. Bears mark trees. Black bears in the Appalachians will claw and bite tree trunks as territorial signage. This is documented behavior. I photographed the scrape, noted it in my field journal, and kept moving. The second sign came about 90 minutes later, perhaps a mile and a half from my camp hollow. The birds stopped. Not gradually. Not in the natural way that bird activity shifts in the late afternoon. All at once, like a switch, the forest went from the normal ambient chorus of late afternoon Appalachian bird life, vireos, thrushes, the distant drumming of a pileated woodpecker I'd been tracking by ear, to absolute silence. I stopped walking. I stood on the trail for a full 2 minutes, listening. Nothing. Not a single bird calling anywhere within hearing range. In 11 years of wilderness guiding, I've experienced this phenomenon exactly twice before that September day. Once before a severe thunderstorm rolled through, the atmospheric pressure dropped silence's wildlife. Once in the cranberry wilderness when I'd unknowingly walked too close to a black bear mother with cubs, the sudden animal silence was the bears reacting to each other, not to me. I checked the sky. No storm building. Clear sky above the canopy, good visibility on the ridge. I checked the trail behind me and ahead. Nothing visible. I stood there in that silence for 2 minutes feeling deeply, inexplicably uncomfortable. Then a single wood thrush called somewhere far to my left, and the ambient sound gradually returned, and I told myself I was overtired and reading too much into normal forest behavior. I made camp 45 minutes later and ate dinner and watched the light die and thought about nothing in particular. The third sign, the one I absolutely should not have explained away, came at 8:17 p.m. I was already in the tent, reading on my phone with the tent door zipped but not yet fully asleep, when from somewhere up the ridge, I estimated 300 to 400 yards above camp, I heard a sound that made me sit bolt upright. A single vocalization. Deep. Resonant. Almost below the threshold of hearing but felt as much as heard, a low rolling sound that vibrated slightly in my chest cavity. It lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then silence. My first conscious thought, coyotes starting up early. But even as I thought it, I knew it was wrong. I know coyote vocalizations in granular detail. This had none of the characteristic yip-howl quality of a coyote. It was too low, too singular, too controlled. I lay back down. I told myself it was a great horned owl making an unusual call. They can produce remarkably deep sounds. I'd heard them do strange things in remote hollows before. I turned off my phone light and closed my eyes. At 9:02 p.m., according to my phone log, I fell asleep. At 2:58 a.m., I woke up. The circling begins. No alarm, no dream, no gradual surfacing from sleep. 1 second I was completely unconscious. The next I was wide awake, eyes open in total darkness. Every sense at maximum alert before my conscious brain had processed a single reason why. Combat veterans describe this phenomenon, the body knowing before the mind does. I'm not a veteran. But wilderness guides develop a version of the same thing. 11 years of sleeping in remote forests trains your nervous system to flag anomalies before your conscious mind catches up. My nervous system was screaming. I lay completely still, controlled my breathing, listened. For the first 20 seconds, nothing, just the creek, just the wind in the high hemlock canopy above, just the normal sounds of a remote Appalachian hollow at 3 a.m. And then I heard it. To my left, the 10 o'clock position relative to the tent door. Footsteps in dry leaves, heavy, deliberate, slow, not a deer's 4-beat step pattern, not a bear's shuffling amble. 2-beat, left, right, bipedal. I sat up slowly, silently. My headlamp was clipped to the tent ceiling. My fixed blade knife was in its sheath attached to my pack, 6 inches from my right hand. I didn't touch the headlamp. I didn't touch the knife yet. I just listened. The footsteps moved to 9 o'clock. Still the same pace, unhurried, heavy, precise. Then 8 o'clock. Then 7, moving around the tent, circling. My brain went through rapid threat assessment. My first thought, another hiker. Someone who'd come into the hollow in the dark, didn't see my tent until they were close, now navigating around it. But hikers have headlamps. Hikers make noise, breathing, gear sounds, the rustle of pack straps. Hikers speak when they realize they've nearly walked into someone's campsite. This was completely silent except for the footsteps themselves. 6 o'clock. Directly behind my head, I could hear the individual leaf compressions now, heavy, full, the sound of significant weight being placed with control and deliberate care. Not stumbling, not rushing, controlled. 5 o'clock. 4 o'clock. 3 o'clock, the right side of the tent. My hand found my knife. I unclipped it from the sheath without drawing it. Just held the handle. 2 o'clock. And then the footsteps stopped. 1 o'clock position. Just to the right of the tent door. Dead silence. I stopped breathing. 15 seconds of absolute silence. 20, 30. And then, from that exact position, no more than 4 feet from the tent wall, a sound that I can only describe as a long, slow, deliberate exhale through large nostrils. The kind of sound an animal makes when it is scenting something, testing the air. processing information. Right there, 4 feet away. On the other side of a half-inch of nylon, my entire body went cold. Then the footsteps resumed. 12 o'clock. Directly in front of the door, and it started the second circle. It never left. I am going to tell you what 2 hours and 40 minutes of being circled in a tent in total darkness by something you cannot see and cannot identify does to a person. It doesn't make you scream. It doesn't make you thrash. It doesn't make you do any of the things you imagine you'd do if you ever faced something truly terrifying in the wilderness. It paralyzes you. It reduces you. Regardless of your experience, your training, your physical capability, to the most primitive version of yourself. The version that is 100,000 years old. The version that knows, in its deepest evolutionary memory, that when something is hunting you in the dark, the only option is to be completely still and pray it cannot find you. I activated my GoPro at approximately 3:14 am. I found the button by feel in the dark. I didn't know if it would capture anything useful in complete darkness, but I needed documentation. I needed something beyond my own testimony. I held it against the tent wall, pointed outward at the position of the footsteps as they moved. The footsteps continued their circuit. Here is what I observed over those 2 hours and 40 minutes that I documented in my field journal the following morning, while the memory was still raw and immediate. The creature, and I use that word because no other word is adequate, maintained a consistent orbital distance from the tent of approximately 3 to 5 feet. It never broke inside that distance except for the pauses, of which there were 7 total over the full duration. During each pause it stopped, always at a slightly different position around the tent, and produced that same deliberate exhalation, scenting, processing. The footstep sound was unlike anything I've encountered in a decade plus of wilderness work. The weight impression in each step was massive. I know what a 300-pound black bear sounds like moving through dry leaves. I know what a 200-pound white-tailed buck sounds like. This was heavier than both. The leaf compression was deep and full and resonant. The stride length, which I was unconsciously calculating based on the timing of each footstep, was enormous. My own walking stride is approximately 30 inches, based on the cadence of the steps and my estimate of the circumference of the circuit around the tent. This thing's stride was somewhere between 48 and 60 inches. Consistent with a biped of very significant height. At approximately 4:45 am, roughly 1 hour and 45 minutes into the circling, something changed. The pace slowed further. Already slow, it became glacial, and the pauses became longer and more frequent. And during one of those long pauses, directly to the left of the tent, the 9 o'clock position, I heard something that will live in me until I die. Breathing. Not just the exhalations of scenting. Actual rhythmic breathing. In and out, deep and slow and massive sounding, like the bellows of something with a chest cavity significantly larger than a human's. It was standing completely still. And it was breathing, 4 feet away from me. I pressed myself to the far right side of the tent floor, knife in hand, and I made a decision, deliberately and consciously, not to unzip the tent door, not to turn on the headlamp, not to make any sound or movement that would confirm my exact position inside the tent with any more precision than the creature already had. Because here's the thing I understood in that moment with absolute cold clarity. It already knew I was there. It had known from the beginning. It wasn't circling to find me. It was circling for another reason entirely. And that reason, whatever it was something I did not want to discover. It made a decision. At 5:38 am, the footsteps stopped. Not mid-circuit. Not at a random point in the circle. directly in front of the tent door. 12 o'clock. The same position where the first circle had ended almost 3 hours earlier. I heard it stop. I heard the leaves compress one final time under that enormous weight. I heard the slow settling of something very large coming to a complete and deliberate standstill. And then, silence. I lay in the dark with my knife, and I counted my heartbeats because it was the only thing I could do. 1, 2, 3. All the way to 217 before I lost count and started over. The silence held. At 5:51 am, 13 minutes after the footsteps stopped, the barred owl called, far up the ridge, distant, the first sound from any animal in the hollow since shortly after 3 am. Then a wood thrush, then another. The hollow woke up the way it always did, tentatively at first, then fully, the ambient sound of an Appalachian forest before dawn filling in from every direction. At 6:22 am, gray pre-dawn light beginning to filter through the tent fabric, I unzipped the tent door. 4 inches, then 6, then all the way. I looked out. Empty camp. Gray light through the hemlocks, creek running quietly to the east, my cook kit where I'd left it, my bear canister undisturbed, nothing there. I sat in the tent door for another 15 minutes before I stepped outside. And then I looked at the ground around my tent. What the ground said. The hollow had received light rain 2 days before my camp, enough to soften the soil beneath the leaf layer without making it muddy. Firm, damp earth, the kind that holds impressions. I walked the circuit around my tent, starting at the 10 o'clock position, where I'd first heard the footsteps, and moving clockwise. What I found made me stand up straight and take 3 steps back. Footprints, bipedal, 2-track, left, right, in a clean orbital path around my tent exactly as I'd heard it in the dark. Each print was enormous. I wear a size 11 boot. My boot placed beside the smallest of the prints was dwarfed. The prints measured, and I measured every one of them with the measuring tape I carry in my kit, between 15 and 16 inches in length and 7 inches at the widest point across the ball of the foot. 5 toe impressions visible in the clearest prints, the toes thick and heavy, not the narrow splayed impressions of a bare human foot, but something wider and more powerful. The depth of the impressions told the weight story. In soil that my own 195-pound body left prints approximately half an inch deep, these prints sank between 1.5 and 2 full inches. Consistent with a weight I cannot calculate with certainty, but estimated, based on soil compression physics, at somewhere north of 600 pounds. The stride length measured between 52 and 58 inches. I counted the prints and mapped the circuit. The creature had completed, based on print evidence, 11 full circuits of my tent, beginning shortly before 3 am and ending at 5:38 am. 11 circles. 2 hours and 40 minutes. At the 12 o'clock position, directly in front of the tent door, the prints were deepest. This was where it had paused longest, where it had stood at the end and made its decision, standing there in the gray morning light of that Appalachian hollow. Looking at those prints in the damp earth, I felt something I had not felt since childhood. Completely, utterly, helplessly small. I photographed every print. I photographed the full circuit from multiple angles. I made measurements and recorded them in my field journal. Then I broke camp in 20 minutes flat, a process that normally takes me 45, and I started walking out. I did not stop moving for 6 hours. The footage I almost didn't watch. I didn't review the GoPro footage for 4 days. I'm being honest with you about that. I got back to my truck at the trailhead. I drove 3 hours home to my apartment in Morgantown. I ate. I slept for 14 hours. I got up and went through the motions of being a normal person for 4 days before I sat down at my desk and plugged the GoPro into my laptop. Part of me didn't want to see what was on it. Part of me was afraid that the footage would show nothing, that the darkness would have defeated the camera completely, and I'd have 2 hours of black screen, leaving me with only my testimony and the photographs of the prints. And part of me, the part I'm least comfortable admitting, was afraid that the footage would show something. I watched it. The first 40 minutes were what I'd expected, essentially black. The camera pressed against the tent wall in the dark, the infrared capacity of a GoPro not designed for true night work, giving me almost nothing but digital noise. But at approximately the 47-minute mark, which would correspond to roughly 4:01 am, something changed. The moon had risen sufficiently by that point to cast faint ambient light through the tent fabric. Not much, but enough. And through the single-layer nylon of my tent wall, at the 9 o'clock position, left side, the GoPro captured a shape. A silhouette, standing, fully upright. The top of the silhouette cut off by the upper edge of the tent wall frame, meaning whatever it was stood taller than the tent, which was a 3-person backpacking tent with a peak height of 50 inches. The silhouette was there for approximately 22 seconds, and during those 22 seconds, it moved. Not its feet, its head. The silhouette's upper portion, the head, tilted. Slowly, deliberately. The way something tilts its head when it is listening to something with focus and intention. It was listening to me breathe. The silhouette remained for those 22 seconds, then moved out of frame, continuing the circuit. I have watched that 22-second clip approximately 200 times. I have shown it to 3 people I trust completely. A wildlife biologist colleague, a former Park Service ranger with 19 years in the Appalachian backcountry, and a close friend who is a forensic analyst by profession. All 3 of them watched it in silence. None of them offered an explanation. The wildlife biologist said, "That head tilt is not a bear behavior. Bears don't do that." The park ranger said nothing at all for a long time. Then, where exactly in the mono was this? When I told him, he nodded once, slowly, and said, "That section has a history. I've heard things. I never went back to that drainage after my 2nd season." The forensic analyst examined the footage frame by frame and confirmed no evidence of tampering, compositing, or digital manipulation. His conclusion: whatever created that silhouette was real, physical, and present at the time of recording. I wasn't the first. After September 6th, I did what any rational person does when their entire framework for understanding the natural world gets shattered. I researched obsessively. What I found in the documented history of the Monongahela National Forest and the broader central Appalachian region was not reassuring. West Virginia has one of the densest concentrations of reported upright canine encounters in the eastern United States. This is not fringe internet content. This is documented in county sheriff reports, in National Forest Service incident logs, and in the testimony of rural West Virginia families who have lived along the edges of the Monongahela for generations. The Elk River drainage, which runs through the section of forest where I was camped, has a specific local history. I found 3 separate accounts from the 1990s alone, sourced from actual newspaper records from the Nicholas County and Webster County local papers, describing encounters by hunters and rural residents with a large upright creature in the forest sections adjacent to Gauley Mountain. All 3 describe the same fundamental profile: massive size, bipedal, covered in dark fur, canine facial features, observed at night or in very low light. A retired West Virginia DNR wildlife officer named Gary Pritchard, who spent 26 years managing wildlife in the Monongahela, gave an interview to a regional outdoor publication in 2009, in which he stated, carefully and with obvious discomfort, that over his career he had received multiple reports from credible sources, hunters, surveyors, Forest Service personnel, of something large and bipedal in the southern wilderness sections that could not be accounted for by any species in our documented wildlife inventory. He retired 6 months after that interview was published. I tracked down a paper written in the 1970s by an Appalachian State University anthropologist documenting oral traditions of the Cherokee and Shawnee peoples who historically inhabited the central Appalachian region. Among the traditions documented was consistent reference across multiple tribal accounts to a creature the Shawnee called something that translates roughly to the one that walks the ridge at night, described as tall, upright, with the face of a dog and the intelligence of a man, territorial, nocturnal, and most significantly, a circler. A circler. The tradition specifically noted that this creature, when encountered near a human camp, would circle the camp through the night as a form of assessment. It was deciding. And in the oral tradition, the outcome depended entirely on the human's response. Those who stayed still and quiet through the circling were found alive in the morning. Those who left the tent were not. I read that passage 4 times. Then, I sat back in my chair and thought about every single decision I'd made between 2:58 a.m. and 5:38 a.m. on September 6th in that hollow below Gauley Mountain. I had stayed still. I had stayed quiet. I had not opened the tent door. Not by knowledge, not by preparation, by pure instinct and terror. And I was sitting in my apartment in Morgantown, reading about it instead of being a SAR statistic in the Monongahela case files. 11 years, 1 night, 1 truth. I still guide in the Appalachians. People ask me that first. Do you still go out there? Yes, I still go out there. The wilderness is my livelihood and my identity, and I refuse to surrender it to fear. But things are different now. I no longer camp in the Elk River drainage. That's a personal line I've drawn, and I won't cross it. I no longer dismiss the accounts of people who come back from remote wilderness with stories that don't fit the conventional wildlife inventory. I've sat with 3 separate clients over the past 2 years who described experiences, sounds, sightings, evidence that I now hear completely differently than I would have before September 6th. I believe them. All of them. I've also had 2 conversations with other wilderness professionals, one a long-distance trail runner who covers massive distances solo through the central Appalachians, one a backcountry hunting guide operating in the northern Monongahela sections, who, when I carefully and privately shared my experience, looked at me with something I can only describe as grim recognition and told me their own stories. Stories they'd told no one else because they feared what it would do to their professional credibility. One of them, the hunting guide, told me something that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since he said it. He said, "The thing you have to understand about whatever these things are, they've been here longer than the trails, longer than the Forest Service, longer than any map anyone has ever drawn of these mountains. We moved into their territory and built our trails through their living room, and most of the time they just watch us pass through. But sometimes, for reasons we're never going to fully understand, they decide to let you know they're there." He paused for a moment. Then he said, "You got let off easy, brother. What it did to you, circling and leaving, that was it giving you information, telling you something. You want to know what it told you?" I asked him. He said, "It told you this is its mountain, and it wanted to make absolutely certain you knew that too." I've thought about that conversation 100 times since he said it. I think he's right. I think whatever walked those 11 circles around my tent on September 6th in that hollow below Gauley Mountain was not hunting me. It could have. Given the weight of those prints, given the size of that silhouette, given what I've since researched about documented Appalachian encounters, it absolutely could have. It didn't. It circled me. It breathed on the other side of my tent wall. It tilted its head and listened to me trying not to die of fear inside a 50-inch nylon shell. And then, at 5:38 am, it stood directly in front of my door. And it made a decision. And it walked away. Into the hemlocks. Into the dark. Into the mountain that has been its home for longer than any of us have names for these places. I will tell you what I believe with everything I have after 11 years in these mountains, and one night that restructured my entire understanding of what lives in them. There are things in the deep Appalachian wilderness that have never been catalogued, never been named by science, never been understood by anyone operating within the conventional boundaries of what we believe is possible in these forests. They are territorial, they are intelligent, they are enormously, devastatingly powerful, and they are, for reasons we cannot fully know, making a choice, night after night, encounter after encounter, to let most of us leave. Most of us. I need you to hear me on this. I am not someone who wanted this story. I did not go into the Monongahela on September 6th looking for a Dogman encounter. I went in because it's my job, because I've done it hundreds of times, because I thought I knew those mountains as well as anyone alive. I didn't know them at all. Whatever is in those deep wilderness sections of the central Appalachians, whatever left those prints, whatever created that silhouette, whatever breathed 4 feet from my face on the other side of nylon at 4 am, it was there long before I showed up with my GPs and my bear canister and my 11 years of confidence, and it will be there long after all of us are gone. If you are planning a solo backcountry trip into the Appalachians, into the Monongahela, the George Washington, the Jefferson, the Nantahala, the Cherokee, I am not telling you not to go. But I am telling you this. When the birds stop, when the forest goes completely silent in the middle of the night, when you hear something heavy and deliberate begin to move around the outside of your tent in the dark, stay still, stay quiet, do not open the door. And pray, sincerely, genuinely pray, that whatever is out there makes the same decision it made on September 6th, in that hollow below Gauley Mountain. Because the alternative is something I don't want to think about, and something I will never, as long as I live, go back to find out. If this story reached something deep in you, you know what to do. Subscribe. The Monongahela has more than one hollow. And I have more than one story. Have you spent nights alone in the Appalachians? Tell me what you heard. Tell me what you saw. I want to know.